Okay. Hi, everybody. I just want to wish a big mazal tov to Samantha Hambling on the engagement of her daughter. So, Mama,
Thank you.
Harbe mazal tov. Very exciting news. It's a big milestone. B'ezrat Hashem.
Mazel tov.
Shiyu rak smachot. Mamash.
Thank you.
Okay. So I just wanted to give like a short recap of the shir that we had 2 weeks ago about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. As we were introduced to him, we see what an enigmatic, interesting, fascinating character who plays this huge role in our history. He was one of the Chachamim, a sage in the first generation of the Tanaim. The Tanaim are the great rabbis that appear in the Mishnah. He lived during the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He was one of the younger students of Hillel HaZaken, the famous Hillel and Shammai Hillel. He was his spiritual heir once Hillel passed away. On Hillel's deathbed, he was able to recognize the greatness of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this greatness was actualized. He had this intense depth of knowledge of Torah. And as they say about him, that he just knew everything. Wherever he walked, he wouldn't go Dalet Amot without learning. He never slept, not even for a short little nap to kind of revive himself in the Beit HaMidrash. And he was the one who opened the door for his students, as we saw in Masechet Sukkah. He was this great pedagogue who, you see the words in Pirkei Avot of go out and figure out, tell me, what is the right way to be? And he valued the different strengths of each of his students, didn't try to make them conform to one another, rather valued that they each had their own special strengths. So that was just a short introduction to the person that Rabban Yochanan ben Gamliel was, and we saw towards the end of the shir that he started to transcend, to be able to have this vision that transcended just the existence of Judaism through the temple service of the Beit HaMikdash, which was something that was, once we built the Beit HaMikdash, this was unknown to Am Yisrael, that we would be able to even exist without a Beit HaMikdash as the center of our spiritual lives. Okay, so if we look in the first source, we're going to just bring in two more sources that give a little bit of an insight into who he was before we delve into this huge decision that I introduced 2 weeks ago, this fateful decision of Yavna versus Yerushalayim. And as it says in Brachot, that they say about Rabban Yochanan, Shelo hikdimo adam shalom me'olam v'afilu goy bashuk. No one ever preceded him in greeting someone, not even a Gentile that was in the marketplace. He was always the first one to greet, which is very special considering that he was a man that never walked Dalet Amot without learning Torah. But for him, this was all part of the experience. This was who he was. He understood the importance of greeting every person with a smile. And this also really correlates to that idea of what we spoke about, how he was the first one to open the door for his students. It wasn't that the students would open the door for him or that he would ask someone else to open the door. It was he himself that would open the door. It was he himself that would be the first one to greet. And in the second imagery in Psachim, we see, it says in the Braita, they said about Rabbi Yochanan that he would Yoshev b'tzilo shel hechal, he would sit in the shade of the Heichal of the Beit HaMikdash, which was the street adjacent to Har HaBayit, in the shade of the sanctuary, and he would doresh kol hayom. All day he would expound to multitudes of people because there wasn't enough room for all of these people indoors, and it was better for social distancing. Just kidding. But he was sitting. He was beneath the shade of the Beit HaMikdash. And this imagery, I say this with a little bit of sadness because we here know the rest of the story. We know the end of the story. But this imagery of the shade, right? The shade is something that protects us from the harsh sun, something that we feel relief, right? From the heat, from the harshness of being outside. And this is something that was slowly about to come to an end as we start to see the first signs in our next in Yomatz, they start to explain that even 40 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, there were all these different signs that prior to it, that there was the special goral that would happen in the Kohen Gadol's hand, and that wouldn't work, or the chut hashani, right, the crimson strip of wool that was tied to the head of the goat, that didn't turn white, and the lamp didn't burn continuously. And then it says something interesting, that v'hayu daltot ha'hechal, the doors of the Beit HaMikdash would open themselves, right? So it sounds a little bit like a bit of a horror film, right? That the doors are on their hinges, opening up by themselves. Ad shegar ben Rabbi Yochanan, he would say to them, he would scold them, and he said to them, Hechal, sanctuary, mipnei ma ata mavie et atzmacha. Why are you frightening yourself with these signs? This is a scary sort of imagery of doors opening to themselves. Yodea ani, I know shesofcha atid lecharev. I know that in the future you're going to be destroyed. Well, how do I know this? Because of that daunting prophecy of Zakkai, when it says in the pasuk, "Petach Levanon dlatecha." Lebanon, open your doors of Lebanon, and Lebanon is another way of calling the Beit HaMikdash, v'tochal esh ba'arazecha, and the fire is going to devour your cedars. Okay, so this imagery of the doors opening and then the doors being destroyed, of the fire coming in and consuming the Beit HaMikdash. So we go from Rabbi Yochanan standing and in the shade of the Beit HaMikdash and teaching all day long, to scolding the doors that are opening of themselves and telling them, I know what's going to happen to you. Closer to the Chorban of Bayit, there are all these agadot, there are all these stories that we are actually allowed to read on Tisha B'Av, and heartbreaking stories of the lead up to the Chorban, to the Beit HaMikdash, and the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, which we won't get into. But there's this fascinating story that gives us a little bit of a background of what was going on during that time. So it says here that Rabbi Tzadok, who was a Kohen, okay, so he would fast for 40 years. We saw that 40 years before that, right? He would fast and daven for 40 years that Yerushalayim would not be destroyed. And we're not going to read it inside. We don't have enough time, and it's all Aramaic. So we're going to really be focusing on the English. It says here that he became so emaciated from fasting that when he would eat something, it was visible from the outside of his body. Okay. And when he would eat after a fast, they would give him figs, and he would suck out the liquid and cast the rest away because he wasn't able to physically digest the outer part of the fig. He would only he would live on just the juice part. Okay, and so here we have that imagery as well of Rabbi Tzadok 40 years before this impending doom, aware of what's going on, the same way that Rabbi Yochanan was aware of what's going on, and it's slightly different reaction. The reaction of Rabbi Tzadok, not slightly, it's actually there's a rift, right? There's a big difference in how they react. Rabbi Tzadok isn't giving up. He's fasting and he's davening to the point where he could barely digest anything in his body, and Rabbi Yochanan is very aware. He says to the doors, I know what's going to happen, right? And the continuation, a few lines later, they start to bring in the story of what happens with the Biryonim. Okay, so just a little bit of a backdrop, that Yerushalayim was under siege by the Romans, and they had this extremely low chance of any sort of victory. And there's a rebellion within the walls of Yerushalayim. There's a rebellion led by the zealots, the Biryonim, however you want to call them, hooligans, zealots, whatever name you want to give them. And as Rav Ari Khan points out, they have three possibilities here. They can either engage in battle, or they can use the storehouses to sustain them for years on end, which it says also, I didn't bring all of the sources in, because lots and lots of stories here, but there were 4 rich people within the community that were able to give enough food and wine and drink for them to live. So the next possibility is to just live off of what they have, and this would sustain sustain them, and maybe possibly Rome would lose interest and leave them alone and not destroy the Beit HaMikdash. The third possibility is to surrender to the Romans. Now, the rabbis are in favor of surrendering to the Romans, and the zealots are in favor of fighting. And it's unclear what the opinion from these stories of the masses were. Um, and so that's just the backdrop. Here it explains in this story that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he meets Abba Sikara. Ara Sikara was his nephew. He meets him. In private. He has to meet him secretly, okay, because the zealots are controlling everything that's going on, and this is also a real example of sinat chinam, that the zealots, because they wanted to fight so badly, they destroyed all of the storehouses of food so that the people would be completely desperate, that they would wipe away that possibility of even just being sustained for the next who knows how many years. They destroyed the storehouses, so they were left in this desperate situation. So Rabbi Yochanan calls him in secret, and he says to them, why are you going to kill everybody through starvation? You're the leader of these zealots. Do something about this. How can you put the Anshe Yerushalayim, the people of Jerusalem, in this position? And Abba Sakira, he says, and this is when you see how people get out of hand, he says, even though he's the leader of these people, he says to him, if I come out against them, they're going to kill me. A horrible situation Am Yisrael has come to. So he gives him advice, and he tells Rabban Yochanan, he says to him, pretend to be sick, okay, and have everyone come and ask about your welfare, and people will think, and everyone will start talking and think that you're sick, okay? And then afterwards, and he gives them all this advice to fake your death, okay, fake your death, and have your students enter in to carry you in a coffin, so that this would be the only way to get out of the gates of Yerushalayim, so that you can possibly negotiate something with Vespasian, okay, the leading general of Rome at that time. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan takes his advice, and he does this, and he comes to the entrance of the city, and the zealots are there, and they want to pierce the coffin just to make sure no one in there is really alive, right? If someone's alive, they wouldn't let them pierce him. And they have this whole negotiation and say, how could you pierce the Gadol Hador? This is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. What will they say about you? And eventually they get through without being checked. And they come outside, and they reach the Roman camp, and he says to Vespasian, greetings to you, the king, greetings to you, the king. Okay, so he calls him the king, and Vespasian says to him, okay, you are chayav mita, you're liable for death twice. One, because I'm not a king, and you're calling me a king. How could you call me the king? There's the real king of Rome. How can you possibly call me the king? And the second thing is, if I am a king, then how come you haven't come to see me until now? Right? What respect is that? And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai goes on to say to him, in truth, you are a melech, because even if you're not a king right now, then you're going to be a king in the future, because we know that Yerushalayim will only fall in the hands of a mighty one, of a king, and also through the psukim, and then very close afterwards, he finds out that the actual king dies, and that Vespasian has been elected by the people to become the king, which is very impressive that Rabbi Yochanan knew this about him. And then when he says, and asks your second question, what if I'm a king, why didn't I come until now? Well, there are zealots who would not allow us to come. Okay. So Vespasian, then they start to get into this very interesting conversation, which is filled with a lot of imagery here as well. And as it says, the understanding that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was prepared to ask him not to destroy the temple, Vespasian says to him, okay, and he gives him a mashal, and he says, if there's a barrel of honey, and you want that honey, and a snake is wrapped around it, wouldn't you break the barrel in order to kill the snake, right? You want to make sure, you want to kill the snake because the snake is dangerous. And so, but even if you have a barrel of honey, which is something that you want, you'd be willing to sacrifice the barrel of honey in order to kill the snake. What's the barrel of honey? The barrel of honey is Yerushalayim. And the snake are the zealots, the rebels that are rebelling against Rome. So in order to destroy these zealots, because what's giving them their motivation, what's giving them their fuel, their energy, the Beit HaMikdash, that's what they're fighting for. Let's destroy Jerusalem in order to destroy them. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was silent, and he didn't answer. So interestingly, it says here that he's attacked for this by either Rav Yosef, or some say it was Rabbi Akiva, and they quote a pasuk that's from Yeshayahu, that's Meshiv Chachamim Achor V'Da'atam Yisakel, that there's a pasuk that says, I'm the Lord who turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolish. This is what they say about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that at this moment he should not have been silent, but he should have retorted back with the same mashal, but said to them in response, if we have such a case, then we take tongues, we remove the snake, kill the snake, and this way leave the barrel intact. So to kill the rebels and leave the city as it is. Okay, and then here it says, in the meantime, as they're talking, a messenger comes and says that the emperor has died and that Vespasian is appointed. Okay. So this is the part, this is the climax. This is the part we've been waiting for, the request, the big decision that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had to make that seemingly so haunts him for the rest of his life. Vespasian says to him, I'm going to Rome to accept my new position. I'm going to send someone else. Ask of me something that I can give you. Okay? And so here, I just want you to also see it in the bold. Amarle, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, Tein li yavna v'chachamecha v'shoshilta de Rabban Gamliel v'asfata de Misayle le Rabbi Tzadok. Okay, these are the three requests that he makes, the three famous requests, and he says to him, give me Yavna and its sages, and don't destroy it. Spare the dynasty of Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi, and the dynasty of Rabban Gamliel goes all the way back to the dynasty of David HaMelech, Zer David HaMelech, Malchut David. And lastly, give me doctors to heal Rabbi Tzadok. Poor Rabbi Tzadok, right? We read about him before, fasting for 40 years, can't digest even a fig. He drinks the juice. I need a doctor for him. Okay, so we have these three requests, interesting requests. Usually we just focus on the Tein li Yavna v'chachameh, give me Yavna, and we're going to discuss these three requests later on. And once again, we see the same bikoret, the same criticism of either Rabbi Yosef or Rabbi Akiva, and they apply the same pasuk, and they say, who turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolish? Because what should he have done? He should have said, leave the Jews alone this time. Give me Yerushalayim. Why is he asking for Yavna? Give me Yerushalayim. And we ask ourselves that as well. We're reading it. He's clearly Vespasian, and also just through this story, we can see with his shoe and all these, we're not going into it, but the whole story, he's very impressed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is a moment of chesed, right? And he says to him, give me a request, granting him his three wishes. This is the genie, right? So what? He's not going to ask for what we really, really want. He's going to ask for Yavna. So why didn't he ask for Yerushalayim? Why didn't he make this request? And the thinking of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was that Vespasian might not do that much for him. If he asked for it, and he would get nothing. But here there would not. Here, if he asked for something, there might be even something small to salvage, right? As the words here it says here. Vatsala porta, right? If you would ask for everything, loavi, that wouldn't work. Vatsala porta, nami loavi. And there wouldn't be even a small thing to salvage. Now, what he's asking for, I know that it's lost, right? I know that we don't have Yerushalayim. This destruction has been impending. But I want to save just something. And that's why he asks for Yavna. Okay. Now, there's different, there are a few versions of this story, and we're not going to look into all of them. There's Echa Rabbah, and also in Avot de Rabbi Natan, there's also a different version. But our main focus will be the Gemara, which has the Gemara that we just read, which has the most authority. And so we usually focus on that account, but there are different accounts that kind of either they contradict or they show the story from different angles, okay? A different topic for a different time. So in Avot Rabbi Natan, it says it gives the heartbreaking description of what happens when Yerushalayim is actually captured. Yerushalayim is being captured. V'haya Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was sitting there. ומצפה ובחרד כנגד מקום שהיה אלי יושב ומצפה. Okay, and so he was sitting there and he was waiting and he was trembling before God, the same way that imagery of Eli sat and watched, as we saw in Shmuel Aleph, that Eli saw his heart trembled because of the Aron Hashem. And when he heard that שהחריב את ירושלים ושרף את בית המקדש, and the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, he rents his clothes, and his students rent their clothes. והיו בוכים וצועקים, they're crying and they're screaming. וסופטים, and they're giving lamentations. ואומר, as it says in Zechariah, פתח לבנון דלתך, the pasuk that we read before, open your doors, the pasuk that Rabbi Yochanan said to the doors, right? So here it's saying it in this context of the destruction, that Petach Levanon Delatecha, Lebanon will open its doors, and this is referring to the Beit HaMikdash, V'tochal esh ba'arazecha, and a fire is going to consume your cedars. This is referring to the Kohanim Agdolim, that the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, they took their keys in their hands and they threw it up. Okay, we could just imagine them standing there. The Beit HaMikdash is being destroyed. This is their home base. This is their home, the Kohanim, and this is where their work is. This is their entire life, their entire service of God. They're taking the keys and they throw it back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? And on a small level, we can all kind of really on a very minute level, when we leave a place that's very meaningful to us. And I know when I left my previous place of employment, a place that I really loved for 4 years, giving back the keys is the hardest part, right? Because the keys was the key represented that I was the worker there, and I was able to open the door and do the service that I was meant to do. And here, this imagery of them, they're throwing back the keys, they're giving back the keys to Kadosh Baruch Hu, and they're saying to him, Ribono shel olam, these are your keys that you gave us, but we weren't good enough. We weren't good enough. We weren't faithful enough to do the king's work and to eat at the king's table. Okay, so once we see that the destruction has happened, and the reaction of Rabban Yochanan ben Gamliel, we have this description, this heartbreaking moment of returning the keys to Hashem. We have this question of, is it all or nothing? What happens now? What happens after the destruction? And it's interesting also in the sources to see that the nation was really grappling with how to respond with this destruction. Where do they go from now? And so it says in Baba Batra that when the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, it says in the Tosefta that a lot of people wouldn't eat meat and they wouldn't drink wine. And Rabbi Yoshua has this whole conversation with them, this whole negotiation, I would say, discussing this behavior, right? To refrain from basar v'yayin. Okay, and he says to them, why? And he said, and so he says to them, my children, what reason are you not eating meat and why are you drinking wine? And they say to him, how could we possibly eat meat from this is where we brought our korbanot, and how could we possibly drink wine? This is what nisucha yain, they would pour as a libation upon the mizbeach. And Rabbi Yeshua and said to him, but if so, according to your logic, then how could we still eat bread? Bread was part of the korban mincha. And they said, you're correct. So maybe we should stop having bread, and we'll have fruit instead. And he says, but the fruit were the bikurim, right? So then they said, okay, you're correct. So we'll no longer eat of the 7 species of the land. And so he says, and he says to them, if so, then we should stop drinking water, right? Because water also was part of Nisuch HaMayim. That was a big part of the water libation, the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. So then we shouldn't drink water anymore. And that's when they were silent, because they realized that they couldn't survive without water. And just through this conversation, this negotiation of what are of people that are responding to such a huge tragedy, and they're trying to figure out how to go on and how to keep the memory of the Beit HaMikdash alive and how to remember the destruction, they're trying to figure out what to do. And so Rabbi Yeshua says, the Chachamim give us another way. They explain to us another way that we can act. And they say, and he explains to them, Rabbi Yeshua says to them, that it's impossible to not mourn at all is impossible. We must mourn, right? The decree has been issued, the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. But to mourn excessively, like what you're doing, that's also impossible, because we can't do something that the tzibur cannot withstand, and the majority cannot withstand to abstain from wine and meat until the next Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. And so rather, what can we do? And this is where we have that idea of all the different ways that we have Zecher LeMikdash. Of in our houses, when you go into a Jewish home, there's the square, the Amma by the Amma, that's when you plaster your house, you leave a square unfinished. And they bring in a few different examples of how whatever we do, we don't do it ad asov, we don't do it in completion, right? At a wedding, we break the glass as Zecher LeMikdash. We're remembering the Beit HaMikdash, that our simcha, our home, when we build our home, it's not complete because we no longer have the Beit HaMikdash. And this is the tightrope, I would say, of the response, right? The tightrope of the response to such a tragedy, that to continue to mourn and to continue to hold that mourning within our hearts, because kol hamitabel al Yerushalayim ro'eh b'simchata, whoever holds on to that mourning is also one that will see it in its glory. And Dafka, as the in Hagyonei Halacha, he explains beautifully that the mourning that we have is actually a sign of hope, because we only mourn for something endlessly when it's still something that's alive, right? And he brings in that example of Yosef and Yaakov, that Yaakov, vayima'en litnachem, he refused to be comforted because Yosef was really still alive, even though he didn't know him. So the same too, we refuse to be comforted. We continue to mourn because the Beit HaMikdash is something that's really alive to us. It's going to come back at any moment, Bezrat Hashem, okay, as we always say. So how do we carry out this balancing act? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai helped us out. In addition to building Yavna, as Rav Ari Khan explains beautifully, that Yavna is like the word Yibaneh, that it will be built. So yes, at this moment, in this time, he understands that when he's asking for these 3 requests, which we're going to look at now, that when he asks for these 3 requests, he understands that Yavna from Yibaneh, something will be built, that right now this is revolutionary. Okay, he's going to set up a place where he's going to bring this vibrant life of Judaism that's not centered around the service in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, nowadays we would have the opposite issue, right? If the Beit HaMikdash were to be rebuilt, it would be this huge, we would need to adapt to that, because we're so used to the Judaism that exists, b'zchut Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's decision to ask for Yavna and to rebuild. And so one of the ways that we can remember the Beit HaMikdash is through these takanot. And for example, he brings in that an example of the lulav, that during the times of the Beit HaMikdash, the lulav was taken in the Beit HaMikdash for 7 days, but the rest of the country outside of the Mikdash, it was only taken for 1 day, for the first day, as it says in the Pasuk. But once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that the lulav would be taken even in the rest of the country for 7 days. And that's what we do. And the reason why is Zecher HaMikdash, to remember the Beit HaMikdash. Now, there's a difference between, as Rav Aryeh Leibowitz points out, there's a difference between Zecher HaMikdash and Zecher LeChorban. Zecher LeMikdash, remembering the Beit HaMikdash, is to remember the glory of the Beit HaMikdash. And he brings in this great example of how with Pesach, right? Pesach, while we're getting ready for Pesach, it's until Erev Pesach, it's so hectic, right? Everything, we're cleaning our house, we're getting rid of all of the chametz, we're trying to make all of our plans, we're buying everything. It's extremely stressful. But then Erev Pesach comes, and that day is like, when we're no longer allowed to have, once the bir chametz, we're no longer allowed to have chametz, and we're not allowed to have matzah. So we're in this like in-between state, and it's all quite calm because there's nothing really to do. We're a bit in a limbo state. But what he was saying, that in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, it was the opposite. It wasn't this calm day. It was that everyone was coming around the Beit HaMikdash and setting up their Korban Pesach. And if you can imagine it, right, I guess the closest imagery that I can possibly think of, and not the same thing, but the barbecues that are going on in Gan Soccer on Yom Ha'atzmaut. That's anything but calm, but it's like this excitement, this vibe that's going on. And so Zecher HaMikdash is just to remember that glory, to understand that we no longer have this, right? It's kind of like also when we're sitting at the table and we're discussing what life was like before COVID, right? We keep on saying before COVID, right before it hit, we had 40 people for our Seudat Purim, and we remember that with like with a longing to go back to that time. So here we're meant to remember what it was like in the Beit HaMikdash. So we do things in remembrance of that. We take the lulav as a remembrance because that's what they did there. Now, Zecher LeChorban is something else. Remembering the destruction is to understand the devastation of what we lost, is to understand that if we, as Rav Aryeh Leibowitz points out, if we had the Beit HaMikdash, then we would not have had all of these exiles. We would not have gone through the Holocaust. We would still have the Beit HaMikdash. We would still have been in Eretz Yisrael all this time, serving God, Bezrat Hashem. And yet we have gone through such an arduous, painful, painstaking galut because of this destruction. So remembering the Chorban is this heavy, painful weight that we also need to carry. But as we spoke about before, there's that tightrope, that negotiation that Rabbi Yoshua was having with the people that were refraining from having meat or wine and saying, yes, it's impossible not to mourn, but it's also impossible to stop your life and to mourn excessively and to not move forward. And that's also the tightrope that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was walking as well, that it's not that he was discarding the Beit HaMikdash in his decision and saying, listen, we're going to take Yavna v'Chachameh and we're going to replace the Beit HaMikdash and build this vibrant place, because there is a danger of that, right? We can see that. We can see the danger of when there's this very vibrant Jewish life in Chutz La'aretz, and we tend to forget that where the center, where the heart of Jewish life is meant to be, it's meant to be in Eretz Yisrael. And we can't forget that when we build these vibrant communities. So it's always that thin line where we need to remember that, yes, Yavna wasn't the ideal as being the heartbeat, the center, but it was the practical way of moving forward in order to be able to save Judaism, so that Judaism wouldn't be lost. And same as well with all the communities in Chutz La'aretz. If all of the communities were not vibrant and they would all kind of just fizzle out, then we wouldn't have we wouldn't have the Jews and Judaism, right? So we needed that in our years of exile to have those communities. But it's always important to have that Zecher L'Mikdash, to remember that glory and to keep our eyes towards it, to remember where we want to get back to. Now, so these three requests that he asks, Rav Ari Khan wants to explain that these are parallel to the three crowns mentioned in Pirkei Avot and Perek Daled. The three crowns are Torah, Kehuna, and Malchut. And how is it reflected here? So Torah would be revived and learned and taught in Yavna. The Kehuna was through his request of asking for Rabbi Tzadok, the Kohen, to have doctors to be restored. And the Malchut, he's asking for the lineage of Rabban Gamliel, the Nesi'im, because the Nesi'im go back to Melech Beit David. So those are the three requests that he asks in order to ensure these three crowns would be continued. So as we come to the conclusion, with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, about 10 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, we see actually Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai on his deathbed. And if we read inside, Shechala Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, okay, he becomes sick, and this usually connotates that this is the end of his days. And his Talmidim come, and they come to visit him, and when they see him, when he sees them, he begins to cry. And they say to him, his students say to him, and look at the words that they use. Ner Yisrael, that's where the name of the yeshiva comes from. Ner Yisrael. Amud Yimani Patish HaChazak, right? The light of Israel, the pillar, the right pillar, the strong pillar, the strong hammer. What could you possibly be crying about? Amar Lam, he says, if they would take me before a human king, that one day he's alive and the next day he's in his grave, right? He's immortal. And if he's angry, his anger is not eternal. And if he's going to lock me up and imprison me, his imprisonment isn't eternal. And if he's going to kill me, his death is also, his murder of me is also not eternal, because there's the neshama. And I could also appease him with words, and I can bribe him with money. Afal pichen, but even so, if you were bringing me before a king now, hayiti boche, I would cry. Now, as Rav Ari Khan points out, interestingly, he was brought before a king. And we saw that in the Gemara in Gittin. He was brought before a king, and he did face this moment, this trembling moment, and possibly now there's a trigger. There's a trigger that he's remembering that time where he faked his death. He was carried in a coffin as if he was dead before a king, and now here he's actually really on his deathbed, being brought before the real king. And he says, Vachshav, now that you're bringing me before Melech Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Shu Chai V'Kayam, he's eternal. And if he's angry at me, Kaso Kas Olam, his anger is eternal. And if he imprisons me, it's eternal. And if he kills me, it's an eternal death. And I cannot appease him with words, and I cannot bribe God. V'lo od, and even more, I have two paths in front of me, achat shel Gan Eden ve'achat shel Gehenom. Ve'eni yodea be'eze malochim oti ve'lo efkeh. There are two paths in front of me. There's heaven and Gehenim, and I don't know where I'm going. Am I not meant to cry in a situation like that? So the question rises, and we ask ourselves, how is it possible? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, this great pedagogue, this great Torah scholar, this great leader of Israel, the one that opened the doors for his students, the one that chose Yavna because he wanted to save something, because he knew that it didn't have to be all or nothing, and that he couldn't have the all. And he didn't want the nothing, so he wanted to ask and hold on to something. And that something is why we're here today. This Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is crying because he doesn't know where he's going. What does that say about us? Why is he crying? So Rav Ari Khan wants to suggest that it's on this moment that he's having this cheshbon nefesh, and he explains that, oftentimes Elul comes and we push off our cheshbon nefesh and we say, okay, Rosh Hashanah, and then we say, no, Rosh Hashanah, we'll wait till the beginning of Yom Kippur, till the beginning of Yom Kippur, and then we say, no, let's wait till Ne'ilah, right? And oftentimes when we have a cheshbon nefesh, we focus on small things, right? Maybe I didn't have enough kavanah when I said my brachot. Maybe I wasn't kind enough to my neighbor. But when do we actually have a real cheshbon nefesh? When we ask ourselves the huge questions. Is the decision that I, Laura Silberman, made to leave my family at age 18, to make Aliyah, I believe with all my heart that that's the right decision, but is that? Do I take the time to really question the direction, the complete direction of my life, every step that I've made, the huge decisions? Do I do a real cheshbon nefesh? And this is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is doing right now. He's asking the question, did I make a mistake? I was given a request. Vespasian asked me, what do you want? Ask me for something. Should I have asked for Yerushalayim? Was it a mistake that I only asked for Yavna? And with the rationale, we understand the rationale of why he did it, why he did what he did. And we saw the criticism of Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Akiva. But he's asking himself he's asking on his deathbed, the core of his being, am I going to heaven or am I going to Gehenna? And this question, according to Rav Ari Khan, was gnawing at him. It haunted him. It tortured him his entire life. Did I make a mistake? And maybe part of mourning for Yerushalayim is asking that same question. And so they say to him, his students, they say to him, they don't have an answer to that. I mean, who does? And they say, Rabbeinu Barchenu, bless us. And so what does he say? What are his last words that he says to them? I bless you that your fear of God should be as great as your fear of men. And they say, Ad Kan, that's all, right? That's all. That's all. And he says to them, Ulavai, halavai, you should even get to that. Because our fear of man is so much greater than our fear of God. And that's something that we can all relate to. That how often do we do things because we know that someone is watching us, myself included? How often do we have that extra kavana when we're in shul because our teacher is over there or a student is watching? How often do we make the bracha with more kavana? Do we take on a chumrah? Do we do more because we know someone is watching, or we're embarrassed about a sin we're doing only because someone can see? And yet, what will they say about us? Right? We can all relate to that. We're all there. And his students say to them, Ad Kan, that's the level of Mora Shamayim. And he says to them, Ulavai, halavai, you should reach that level, right? Because it's really hard to reach such a level. And the last thing he says to them, Bishat pitirato, at the moment of his death, he says, Panu kelim mipnei atumah, take away all the vessels in the room because of purity. V'achinu kisei lechizkiyahu melech Yehuda shaba, and prepare a chair for Chizkiyahu HaMelech who's coming. So even here, on his deathbed, this moment, the laws of purity, which were the laws that really pertained, they don't have the same significance without the Beit HaMikdash. This is what's occupying him, right? And this is something he made sure that people would know these laws. Because the building of the Beit HaMikdash is meant to be something that's imminent to us, something that's real, something that's going to happen, not just this far off kind of, fantasy, something that's actually real. So for him, it's very real. He's saying, take away the vessels. There's tumah here. I'm about to die. And bring a kisei. And Rav Ari Khan says, perhaps a throne for Chizkiyahu HaMelech. And so why is he asking for this kisei of Chizkiyahu Melech? because Chizkiyahu Melech is coming from the Davidic family, and Hillel was from Zera David, and really the Nasiut that he became the Nasi. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai became the Nasi not because he was from the dynasty of David, but because the Nasi was killed, and Rabban Gamliel, the next Nasi, was too young to take on that responsibility. So this responsibility was thrust upon him. He took upon himself to be the Nasi, and what he does is he creates this new city, which is Yavna. He takes the lineage of the Malchut Beit David of Rabban Gamliel, and now he's saying, I'm going to return this kingship to where it is. And this is going to be the restoration of those three crowns of what, and this is what his life's work was after the destruction. That there would be Yavna, there would be the Kahuna through Rabbi Tzadok, and the Malchut through Rabban Gamliel. And so now a real king, Chizkiyahu Melech, shows up to take him to Gan Eden. And our question, so when we have that question of how do we deal with this impending Khurban, are we in complete denial of it? And do we say, like the Zealots say, we can still fight this, we can still destroy it? Or do you save what you can? And so that this idea of what Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is restoring, and this imagery of the Kisei of Chizkiyahu Melech coming to escort him to Gan Eden, is that it's at the end of his life, we see that for the rest of his life, he's really dealing with the pain of this decision. He's dealing with the consequences of his choices. And these three things that he's asking for is the three things that he built. And so it's just, I think that through these different stories of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, that we can see that when he turns to the doors and he says to the doors, why are you opening and closing, right? I know what's going to happen. I know that you're going to be destroyed. His awareness, the fact that he wasn't in denial of what was going to happen, and he tries to convince the zealots to surrender, and he sees that he's not successful. So he initiates this whole plan of going out in a coffin to greet Vespasian and to negotiate. And rather than, and in front of him, he has that decision. Either he can ask for Yerushalayim or he can ask for Yavna. And he asks for Yavna, because he says, if I ask for Yerushalayim, I won't get anything, but let me hold on to that small thing. And that request is granted. And so I think that from this example of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, we can see that delicate balance, the complexity of that balance, right? How easy it is to be in that extreme of being in complete denial, or of someone that would say at the destruction, okay, let's forget the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Let's throw it all away. And here he comes in with this balance that, and in our personal lives, we can really take that example of how to have that, that sweet spot of having all of these takanot for Zecher HaMikdash. Let's remember the glory of the Mikdash. Let's remember the Chorban of the Mikdash. But we're not going to stop eating meat, and we're not going to stop drinking wine, and we're going to move forward, and we're going to have Torah as the center of our lives. But our eyes are always going to be towards Yerushalayim. We're going to understand that Yavna is not the ideal, right? Life is a journey, not a destination. We're not yet at our destination, but now in our modern times, we're closer than ever, and when we now in our times that we're able to actually be in Yerushalayim and to daven, right? And when I stand at the Kotel, I daven to Hashem and I say to Hashem, please open this wall so I could walk through and walk up to Har HaBayit. We're still there. We're still in that place where our eyes are towards the Har HaBayit, that we should, Bezrat Hashem, remember its glory, remember the weight of the tragedy of this long exile, of what we have, all that we have lost, and pray that we will get back and rebuild what has been taken from us. Okay, are there any questions?